Okay guys, so we talked about hypotenuse leg. We've learned all the ways to prove triangles congruent. Now, we've got this last idea called CPCTC, or your guys' homework and your quiz and your test. They sometimes call it CPOCTAC. That's a long word. I like CPCTC. It's faster, it's easier. But it all means the same stuff. What CPCTC means, or CPOCTAC means, is corresponding parts. Parts meaning angles or sides. So corresponding angles or sides, parts of congruent triangles. So that means we already know our triangles are congruent, have to be congruent. So any one that we don't say, or any pieces that we don't say, like sides or angles, that we don't say are congruent because of side, 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 angle, side, angle, angle, side, angle, side, angle, or HL. So any of the missing pieces that we don't use in our checklist, because of CPCTC, we know that they are congruent. So down here, we know our triangles up here are congruent. I'm telling you that. So because if two triangles are congruent, then we know all their corresponding parts, angles and sides, have to be congruent. So these triangles are congruent. Let's just say it was because of, let's just say, angle, side, angle. Okay? So if these triangles are congruent because of angle, side, angle, then that means everybody else that I'm not talking about, that doesn't have a markup here, like segment AC and segment DF, they have to be congruent because of CPCTC. Say angle C and angle F, they have to be congruent because of CPCTC. Because once my triangles are congruent, that means everything that I didn't talk about, the rest of the information of sides and angles, or angles and sides, they all have to be congruent. So if you know two objects are congruent, that means all their corresponding parts have to be congruent. So kind of marking some things, we know that segment AB, segment DE, they're congruent. I already told you that angle A is congruent to angle D, angle B is congruent to angle E. So notice everything else that we haven't named, they're all congruent because of CPCTC, CPCTC, CPCTC. Okay? So whatever the reason is, okay, whatever your checklist is, anybody that you didn't name, they're all congruent because of CPCTC. So I can come up here now and I know that segment BC has to be congruent to EF. Segment EF. Segment AC has to be congruent to segment DF. Okay? My last angle, angle C and angle F, they have to be congruent to each other. And it's all because of CPCTC. But you have to get triangles congruent first. And the only way to get triangles congruent is one of these 5 reasons. So that's important. That's why we're building upon that. So everything that we just learned about proving triangles congruent, once you get those congruent, we're going to prove some more. Okay? So, and the reason we knew that these guys are congruent is all because of CPCTC. All because of that CPCTC. Okay? So, if we look at this, all right, I'm telling you that these triangles are congruent for whatever reason. Might be side, angle, side, might be side, side, side. Okay, but I'm telling you that these triangles are congruent. I just want you to complete the congruent statement. Give me the other piece that should match up because of CPCTC. 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 My triangles are congruent. These guys have to be congruent because those corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So match it up real quick. Alright, so angle A has to match up with angle M. Again, you can use those congruent statements up here. A and M match up. So that means angle A has to be congruent to angle M because of CPCTC. My triangles are congruent. These guys have to be congruent. CB, so that's this guy, has to match up with, well, C matches up with O, B matches up with N, segment ON. And there you go, CPCTC. Okay. Other pieces, so let's look at this one, XZ, segment XZ. So XZ, it's right there. So XZ has to match up with segment XZ. Segment or angle WZ Z, X, this guy, has to match up with, of course, that guy that's right above him. And let's match up. So W matches up with angle Y. Z matches up with Z. And X matches up with X. So angle WZX matches up with angle YZX. Again, this is all CPCTC. A quick note. CPCTC, why is it important? Because it can be used to prove many ideas between two triangles. For example, I can prove midpoints, angle bisectors, segment bisectors, parallel lines. Maybe I can prove that I have isosceles triangles. So because of CPCTC up here, look at this. These two angles are congruent. That means I know this big angle was cut in half. Okay? I know that this has to be an angle bisector there. I could use CPCTC to prove these guys are congruent, which means that this giant angle right here was cut in half. CPCTC allows us to extend information and to prove other ideas like midpoints, angle bisectors, segment bisectors, parallel lines, and a couple of other ideas. One thing you need to note, though, I probably should have put this down, CPCTC does not prove triangles congruent. It comes after the triangles are congruent. See, when triangles are congruent, then I could talk about CPCTC. Triangles are congruent, then I could talk about CPCTC. CPCTC comes after. Comes after congruent triangles. Okay? It does not prove triangles are congruent. So down here, kind of talking about that idea that we knew up here, CPCTC can extend and allow us to prove midpoints, angle bisectors, segment bisectors. So here, I've got two pictures. I'm telling you that these triangles are congruent. Okay? So triangle ABC, triangle EDC, okay? Triangle XYZ, triangle XWZ. So I'm going to ask you real quick, what would I need to know in order to prove that this line is parallel to this line? Okay? How would I know that these lines are parallel? CPCTC, there is one piece of information that will help me prove that. Use your list of reasons to help you out. Go look at those parallel lines information and see if you can figure out who needs to be congruent because of CPCTC. Same thing over here. I want to know what needs to be congruent in order to prove that angle YXW is bisected by XZ. I kind of talked about that a moment ago. So who needs to be congruent to prove that this giant angle was cut in half? Pause your video now. Try that. All right. So there are actually two things that could be congruent in here because of CPCTC. Since these triangles are congruent, if I knew that angle A and angle E were congruent, these are alternate interior. And this is what I call the hourglass. When you have an hourglass picture with parallel lines, look for alternate interior angles. Okay, so this is like the other picture that you usually see parallel lines on. You had the mountain one, which we saw in the previous videos, which prove corresponding angles. This is what I call the hourglass, and it helps with alternate interior angles. So if I could prove that angle A and angle E are congruent because of CPCTC, then I know that these lines have to be parallel, because if alternate interior angles are congruent, then your lines are parallel. Or vice versa, I could also do it if I said these angles were congruent. If angle D and angle B were congruent, again, they're still alternate interior angles. That would prove that these lines are parallel. Again, they would have to be congruent because of CPCTC. CPCTC, because my triangles are congruent. Okay, over here, if I want to prove that this giant angle right here was bisected, all I would need to know is that these two angles were congruent. Angle YXZ congruent to angle WXZ. And they would be because of CPCTC. I'm telling you, my triangles are congruent. These angles have to be congruent CPCTC, and since they're congruent, we know that they are bisectors.